Debanking looms large in the minds of Americans these days, and particularly large in the minds of political conservatives. Too many Americans have, almost in an instant, learned that their access to financial services, without which a free, independent life cannot be lived in the 21st century, is soon to be cut off. However, it is anything but certain that Americans really understand this issue in all of its complexity. How pervasive is debanking? Is it a sensible regulatory or market response to shady or illegal behavior, or a gross overreach? If it is in fact an overreach, is it primarily the doing of overbearing regulators or sinister big business? Why are there so many debanked persons who are unable to discover why they have become targets? Luckily, there's a new policy paper for this, our favorite thing here in Washington, D.C., which has been written to shed light on this murky issue. I am David McGarry, the research director of the Taxpayers Protection Alliance, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by Nicholas Anthony, a policy analyst at the Cato Institute Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. Nick, thank you so much for joining TPA.
Thank you for having me on the show.
So, the heart of your new paper, which I commend to everybody, is a sort of taxonomy of debanking. Would you explain the four types of debanking you identify, how pervasive each one seems to be, and the ways in which they interact with one another?
Absolutely. So this was a big focus of the paper because I saw a lot of people talking past each other and not quite knowing what the other one was saying. So I wanted to outline this taxonomy where you have four forms of debanking: governmental, operational, political, and religious. And the names kind of give a hint at what they are. So, governmental debanking is when a government agency comes in and says, we need you to stop serving this client. Maybe that's a court order, maybe it's a letter from a regulator, or maybe it's something they say in passing while doing an inspection. Now, operational debanking is what happens in the boardroom. That's what happens when a bank decides this does not fit our business. Maybe it's an unprofitable venture that is too risky to loan to or open an account with, or maybe it just doesn't fit the overall sentiment of the bank. For example, maybe a Christian community bank doesn't want to offer services to adult entertainers. Now, where concerns have really heated up, though, is in political debanking and religious debanking. And these are concerns where people feel that they've been discriminated against. The bank shut down their account solely because of their political views or their religious views. And we tend to see this more often than not be concerns from both conservatives and Christians. And so by breaking these out, I really wanted to, if nothing else, provide a new taxonomy so folks can know exactly what they're talking about and exactly what concerns are on the table, because each one involves a very different policy response.
And as you point out, very often behind some of the instances of supposed political or religious debanking is a government mandate or maybe just a regulator's raised eyebrow. So I want to hone in for a second on the governmental debanking. The standard of our justice system is innocent until proven guilty. And the standard of our banking regulatory regime is the inverse. Individuals who behave suspiciously or even engage in ordinary transactions that regulators have deemed suspicious are liable to be deprived of access to financial services. And there's no proof of misconduct, no day in court, and no opportunity to appeal. So, could you talk a little bit about how governmental debanking has worked in practice?
So there's a few ways. The most egregious has been when we saw in New York, regulators told banks that they should stop dealing with the National Rifle Association. And this was an issue that made its way all the way through to the Supreme Court. We've also seen the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the FDIC, send private letters to banks telling them to cut off cryptocurrency companies. And then we've also seen the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency tell banks that they need to heighten surveillance for select groups of consumers. And when banks look at it, they see this the cost just does not add up. We can't keep serving them by doing this private detective agency on the side. But it's not always so direct. It's also indirect when we look at governmental debanking in the form of the laws and regulations that are on the books. Because even when there's not a heightened concern, banks do have to act as private investigators on behalf of the government. Under what's known as the Bank Secrecy Act, banks have sort of been deputized as part of law enforcement. And I know some folks might hear that and say, well, if someone's doing something wrong, they should be cut off. And a lot of times I'll agree with that. If someone's doing something like financing terrorism or human trafficking, something truly heinous, then yeah, they should get in trouble. The problem is exactly how you put it. The system has been flipped, where it's no longer innocent until proven guilty. And worse yet, that guilt is not for terrorism or human trafficking. Banks have to file something called a suspicious activity report. And one of the most common reasons for that is that somebody made a transaction with close to $10,000 in cash. That's it. It's not that it had drugs spilled out when they dumped the cash at the teller window. It's not that they were flashing a gun in the lobby. It's not that they had known ties to some criminal organization. It's just that they had a lot of money. And when these reports start stacking up, all of a sudden regulators come knocking at their door and saying, you filed a few of these suspicious activity reports. Why are you still serving them? And worse yet, if it turns out that something wrong was actually happening, the bank can find themselves facing millions of dollars in fines. And so this web of laws and regulations really pushes all of the incentives toward banks shutting down the account. And then as you said at the beginning, people find this in an instant with no follow-up, no information about what went wrong. And that's because the law also requires that these reports are confidential. You can't know that a report was filed on you. You can't know the contents of it. It is wholly illegal for the banks to share any of that information. And so all of us on the ground are just left in the dark, left to spiral about what might have gone wrong. What could we have done? How could we have fixed it? We have no idea. And sadly, that is exactly the way the government wants it to be.
One of the things I find most surprising and really shocking about this system is that lack of transparency. And it's always fraught to try to extend principles from the court system elsewhere in society. But I'm going to hazard such a comparison. The idea that one might be suspected of some wrongdoing or might be accused of some wrongdoing. And then not only would one not be able to understand the evidence brought against you, but also have all levels of society, from government to private parties, be legally barred from sharing that information with the suspected or the accused, seems completely at odds with the entire logic of our system.
Oh, I think you're spot on. And it's completely at odds with just good business practices because running a good business is about having a good information flow between the consumer and the business itself. And yet here we have them completely cutting that off. Them being the government is completely cutting off that flow. And so you see all the time that people will react to this in anger, and frankly, I think rightfully so, saying, how dare this bank cut me off after being with them for a decade? I was a loyal customer, and this is how they reward that loyalty. They cut me off with no explanation. If this was just a free market with businesses operating on their own decisions, I think that would be perfectly sound to say that that's a foul there. They should at least tell me what went wrong. And yet people don't realize that they're prohibited from doing so. And it's sort of a painful irony that not only is the reporting side of this confidential, but Also, it's a little bit of a secret in and of itself that this even exists because it might be my favorite pastime, but most people are not reading through the depths of the US code and also regulations. They're not pouring through to see how these shape our conduct, how these shape our interactions in the world. And so, in many ways, Congress has kind of gotten the best case scenario for itself. It's able to shape all the rules that govern us and face none of the consequences for doing so.
Now, one of the other most astounding parts of all of this is that consumers can have their lives either set akimbo or completely toppled over simply on the basis of a series of inferences, none of which necessarily imply any kind of wrongdoing. And I have a particularly good quote from your report. And you say financial institutions know all too well that the government's suggestions are rarely optional. So, could you talk a little bit more about some of these informal ways that the government pressures financial institutions in their decision making, or some of the other inferential mechanisms that wind up in cases of debanking?
Well, this is a big problem because it's hard to grapple with that thought that banks are almost afraid of regulators because most of us we walk down the street and we see this high-rise building for a bank and we see the account numbers or the financial statements rather, and it's this huge giant. Some think of it as the biggest business that's out there. So how can it be afraid of anyone? But the problem is regulators can pull any number of threads to begin levying fines, levying restrictions, and taking the banks apart, basically. And so most banks don't want to be caught talking back, essentially, to the regulators. If they get a notice, it's yes, of course, we'll take care of that right away. Because if they say no, then they might fall under the eye of Sauron, as it be, where all of a sudden they're under scrutiny, they're under the magnifying glass, and every decision is getting second guessed. And so there could be things as little as emails, statements while doing an on-site inspection. It can be statements in a speech, kind of hinting at an action needed to be taken, but no actual citation for the law of regulation that's being violated. And so what ends up happening is banks are overly cautious. They're often reporting things that really don't need to be reported. They're closing accounts that don't really need to be closed because it only takes one to turn into $100 million fine, or it only takes one to attract that attention that then has them strung up, being asked to explain every single decision they've made over the last 5 years. And so we see accounts being closed because of that as well. Even though it's not so direct as having that official order, even the informal pressure is enough to get there. And one of the big ways we see that is through reputational risk regulation, where banks essentially are having their own reputation decided by a regulator in Washington. A far off regulator is deciding this is controversial, this is okay, this is okay. Oh, that's a little controversial, and that's all it takes for somebody to have their account closed down because it's deemed as unsafe and unwise by regulators.
This whole conversation brings to mind an excellent amicus brief in the Supreme Court's Vulo case you referenced. And the point made was essentially that the regulatory morass in the financial services industry is such that a purportedly non-binding statement or suggestion or guidance document has to be taken pretty much as law by financial institutions because they know that, as you said, if they step out of line for even 1 second in one area, there are a million other areas that are subject to regulatory retaliation. If EU, I mean, even if, the slightest amount of pushback is leveled at some regulatory agency, there is a very good chance that banks will have some other switch flipped on them, and then that will create many other problems. So all of the financial and legal incentives align towards I guess over enforcement or towards
Mhm.
more constrictive and controlling activities in the private sector.
I mean, one point to think about with that is indeed in a perfect world, everyone would follow the law with ease. But this is a messy world. And frankly, there's been studies on this before where everybody breaks a law every now and again, whether knowingly or unknowingly. Just look at how fast traffic is on your commute home, and you'll see there's quite a few people who are definitely a fair few miles over the speed limit. And even in more serious cases, there's just people who don't know the full depth of the US code. You have to see articles that are written half in jest about how it's illegal in some towns to kick a can 3 times down the road on a Tuesday. And those are all things that can be brought out of the woodwork that nobody would really waste their time on that. But when somebody has an axe to grind, that's exactly what they'll waste everyone's time on. And we see this in more extreme cases in authoritarian governments where they'll pick people apart just to find that one sliver that they can ruin their life over. One tax filing that missed something or an unexplained transaction or the like. They label it as tax evasion or money laundering and throw their opponents in prison. And we are very blessed in this country that we have the protections that we have, but still, those same types of abuses can quickly unfold.
Yeah, I think there is a larger question of the rule of law that bears emphasis here. Um, whenever you have such a overbearing and extensive regulatory apparatus that gives so many opportunities for selective prosecution, there's no real way to for private individuals or private businesses to have certainty that certain kinds of conduct will result in enforcement and other permitted kinds of conduct will not, which again is one of the fundamental building blocks of the classic notion of the rule of law. So the situation we find ourselves in is one where people and businesses, as we've been talking about, have to walk on eggshells all the time because they know that even if they engage in what they think is permitted conduct, any offense taken by a regulator could result in some sort of action being taken against them.
Yeah, and frankly, it's a little ironic that reputational risk regulation is almost a perfect example of that because a bank run by um, a libertarian, a Republican, and a Democrat, three different banks are going to have very different ideas of what it means to create a good reputation, what it means to cater to their audiences. And what we're talking about here is that it's not their decision, though. It's the decision of a far off regulator or in some cases, many regulators who also may disagree. You very well may have a libertarian, Republican, and Democrat in this regulatory body who's then reviewing and then arguing on their own about what's controversial and what's not. And then it ends up on the business's plate and it may change again in the next year, the year after that, the year after that. It's just far too subjective, and unfortunately, much of the financial regulatory apparatus is in this subjective space. Congress gave a lot of power to the regulators when it came to dissecting this and figuring out what's right and what's wrong. And we're really paying the consequences of that now when we see just how awry this goes. By all means, I think it's safe for me to say most bank customers want their bank to have a strong reputation, to make sound decisions, to be seen as something they can depend on. But this system is not working. It should be left to the banks themselves to decide how they're going to create that reputation. And in the same way, while I'm framing this as a good thing, it can also be a bad thing. Banks are going to make mistakes. They're going to serve the wrong client that creates a controversy that goes viral on social media, or maybe even they'll be too cautious and deny too many clients and create another viral story on social media. But letting them make that decision and then letting customers leave and come as they see fit is how we get to a proper balance here, not having some third party make the decisions for everyone.
I think a lot of this goes back to that Christian community bank you came up with as a hypothetical earlier, denying access to production companies making adult content. That might be seen as prudent and moral decision making by the Trump administration, and the Gavin Newsom administration might send a letter telling those bigots to stop their phobia of sex workers. Now, I would like to ask you what kind of solutions, by way of, wrapping up and maybe coming towards some slightly more hopeful view of the future, as improbable as that is for a weekday. Um, what kind of solutions do you think should be enacted by Congress? Because really, we do need Congress to intervene here. And maybe let's start with actually returning to something that resembles a Fourth Amendment standard of privacy.
Well, that would be music to my ears if we could return to that. And we know exactly where that needs to start, and that's reforming the Bank Secrecy Act. This is the suite of laws now over the past 55 years that has increasingly deputized banks as really law enforcement. And so reforming that so that banks aren't reporting customers in the tens of millions would go a long way towards fixing this. There were 27.5 million reports filed last year, and the bulk of that was just because people had used a lot of cash. That should not be the basis of this system, especially when we look at the follow-up data and see it's not stopping criminals. So reforming that so that people actually have a semblance of financial privacy would go a long way. I think the next step is taking reputational risk regulation off the table. It's clearly been misused. It's far too subjective. Congress needs to step in and tell the regulators this is not allowed. This needs to be taken off the books. Now, to their credit, regulators have heard that this is a problem and they've stepped away from it in the last year. And President Trump issued an executive order calling for its end. However, Congress can't be complacent because of that. Just as easily as regulators took it off their books, they can put it right back on their books with a new administration. And to the same extent, all it takes is a future administration to write an executive order that undoes Trump's executive order. So Congress needs to create a lasting solution so we can have certainty. And on the note of having certainty, one other thing that Congress really needs to do is get rid of the confidentiality that has kept all of this in the dark. People should have transparency and get answers about what's happening. That'll help consumers on the ground in terms of just knowing what happened, knowing that they're not considered a terrorist, or knowing if they did something wrong so they don't make that mistake with a future bank. But also, having that information means that we can get a better feedback loop in terms of creating any future policies that might be warranted. Because right now, getting data on this is really next to impossible. It really all rides on people being willing to share their story with the media and other organizations so that we can try to pull apart what might have happened here. But that's really not how good laws are created. We should have like a firm foundation of information and clear evidence to support laws. Now, I'm hesitant to say luckily, but luckily we have a long history of reputational risk and the Bank Secrecy Act being abused. So those are clear places to act. But Beyond that, I think Congress should hold back on further intervention. There's been a lot of ideas to go much further. Some members of Congress have even called for making it illegal for a bank to deny accounts, almost turning them into public utilities or government-run utilities. That's much too far and much too aggressive of a response based on the evidence we have here. Tackling the Bank Secrecy Act, reputational risk regulation, and confidentiality, those three steps would go a long way to ending the frustration that people have had with debanking and getting us closer to a truly free financial system.
I think the lesson here, as it is in so many other places, is that when you have a situation in which the government is incentivizing a whole host of nasty practices on the part of private industry, it's probably better simply to remove the government static that is distorting the signals, especially when there's no evidence that private industry would engage in these behaviors absent those interventions. Nick, thank
Yes.
you so much for coming on. The report is Understanding Debanking, Evaluating Governmental, Operational, Political, and Religious Financial Account Closures, out this month at the Cato Institute's website. Once again, thank you for coming on. And is there anywhere else besides cato.org where our audience can go to find your work?
Really, Cato.org is the best place, or you could find me at Econ with Nick on X and Noster. But really, Cato.org is the best place to find it all. That'll show you everywhere else that you can go to find my reports, my blogs, and everything in between.
Closing off with a full throated recommendation of the Cato Institute. I think that is just about perfect. Thank you so much.